Bienvenidos alumnos y alumnas a esta parte de nuestra clase virtual. El enfoque de nuestra clase hoy será el presente simple del indicativo y el presente simple del subjuntivo y sus conjugaciones. La semana pasada hablábamos de la conjugación de un verbo regular en los tiempos presentes simples. También logramos hablar un poquito de los verbos muy irregulares. También verbos que sufren cambios ortográficos, por ejemplo, verbos que terminan con car, o verbos que terminan con gar, verbos que tienen problemas con la ortografía, en particular problemas concordantes con las letras C y G. También la vez pasada hablamos de los cambios de raíz, cambios simples de raíz y cambios complejos. Y el enfoque de hoy será los verbos que cambian en la primera persona singular del presente simple del indicativo. In English, they're sometimes called first person singular changers or yo changers. And this is in reference to the yo form of the simple present indicative. Muy bien. Cabal, aquí esa diapositiva está en inglés. So the first person singular changers are these changes affect the first person singular or the yo form of the simple present indicative, and then in turn they affect all forms of the simple present subjunctive. These are true irregularities. They're not spelling changes like we learned about previously. These are irregularities that you do just have to kind of memorize as almost as part of the vocabulary or pieces of vocabulary as you're learning the verbs. But today we're going to learn some spelling clues that will really help us identify which verbs are going to suffer these changes and which will not. Also, we're going to talk in a little bit here about how these changes tend to trump stem changes. You might have verbs with mixed irregularities sometimes. We often have stem changes and spelling changes in the same verb. What we're going to see here is that when you have a stem change and a first person singular change in the same verb, they don't typically coexist. And we'll see that in a few slides here. Muy bien. This little excerpt here in the white box is taken from the table of contents in the section of your course packet that includes the lists of verbs. You have two lists of verbs. One is an alphabetical list. One is a list of verbs organized by their irregularities, and this is from the table of contents in the list of verbs organized by their irregularities. These are the changes that we're going to focus on today. So if you want to follow along in this packet, this is where we'll be. We'll be starting with page 34. You could also follow along in your notes section. If you want to pause the video and turn there in your notes section, you have those sheets where we've kind of been filling in the different irregularities for different simple present tense verbs, and we started with spelling changes and we went to stem changes, and there's also it should say at the top of it, it's a landscape sheet, and at the top of it, it should say simple present tenses 2 of 2, I believe. Okay, so you can pause it and find those sheets, and you should probably have a separate sheet of paper available for note taking as well. Okay, so first we're going to look at the C that sometimes changes to a ZC. Now, this notation with the letter, arrow, letter combination, that looks really similar to the stem changes that we learned about previously, but there's a significant difference. a significant difference, of course, in the way these irregularities work, but also a difference in the notation. So the similarity is that there are letters on either side of an arrow, but the difference is that with the stem changes, you're only dealing with verbs. Remember, the stem changes have that pair of boots that you see in the present indicative and the present subjunctive, and then there's that extra shoelace portion of the subjunctive if you're dealing with a complex stem change. Well, this is going to have a totally different pattern, so don't be confused by the similar notation. When you see consonants on either side of an arrow like this, we're dealing with a first person changer, and that is not going to have the boot shape at all. So don't be confused. These are not stem changes. They're absolutely not. This is a separate category of irregularities. Okay, so this particular irregularity is rather friendly as irregularities go. You can tell by the spelling of a verb that it's going to happen. All verbs that end with CIR or CER, where that C is preceded by a vowel, those verbs are going to be affected by this irregularity. Now remember, when we learned about spelling changes, those orthographic changes, we learned that when a verb ends in CIR or CER preceded by a consonant, we have just the run-of-the-mill spelling change that happens. Nothing unexpected, but this is a true irregularity affecting verbs ending in vowel CER or vowel CIR. So take a look at that list of 4 verbs there and tell me which of those 4, you can pause the video if you need to, which of those 4 do you think is going to be affected by this C to ZC change? You probably thought that bendecir was the only one, bendecir, because the N comes right before the C and that's a consonant. And you would have guessed absolutely right based on the information that I told you. However, there is one verb that's just an anomaly, the verb mecer, or in Spain, mecer. That verb contains a vowel CER ending, so you would think that it would fall into this category that I'm about to introduce you to, but it actually has just a simple spelling change like you have with verbs ending in consonant CER or consonant CIR. So it's very odd. Be sure to commit that one to memory because it is the oddball. Okay, let's take a look at a verb that I'm sure you are all familiar with, the verb conocer. Remember, we use conocer to talk about being acquainted with people or places, sometimes concepts, but we do not use conocer to say that we know something. So, let's look at how the verb might conjugate if we didn't do anything unusual to it, if we just took off the ER and we added our normal endings. Right away you know there's an issue because the original verb says conocer with a soft C sound, and right away in the yo form of the simple present indicative over there on the left, we've written conozco with the hard C sound. So if you weren't familiar with this verb, which I'm sure you all are, you might expect there to be some kind of a spelling change that would do away with this anomaly of pronunciation. But since this verb ends in vowel CER, we're actually going to do something else. And I bet you all know what that is. These are the 2 odd areas, so you'll see the CO in the first person singular, co, and then the CA in all of the subjunctive forms is problematic. Ca, cas, ca, camos, can, and we wanted a soft C sound before we knew that this was going to have an odd irregularity. And you see the ending, and our clue there, the vowel CER, that's going to tell us that this is going to have a Z to ZC change. So let's see what that looks like. The first thing we're going to do is to change the C in the first person singular form of the simple present indicative. We're going to change that C to a ZC, and we end up with conozco, or in Spain, conozco, in the first person singular of the simple present indicative tense. It's not going to affect any of those other conjugations in this tense, or in this mood rather, mood being the indicative, or mode, in Spanish, modo. So that's the one form that's affected. Now, in first person changers like this, that one form, the yo form of the simple present indicative, is going to be our basis for all of the present subjunctive forms. So we're going to take off the O ending as our root, and that is how we're going to build the simple present subjunctive for the verb conocer. So you end up with es importante que yo te conozca, que él te que tú le conozcas, que él me conozca, que nosotros conozcamos, que ellos conozcan, and you'll see that it affects all of those forms. So again, this is another reason why it's really important for you to be able to distinguish the different patterns of irregularity. We saw a boot-shaped pattern last time. This is not like that. This is the yo form of the indicative being used to form all of the present subjunctive conjugations. Let's look at the verb traducir, or in Spain, traducir. Now, there are some spelling clues to tell you what to do here. It ends in a vowel, CIR, and that vowel is the key. It tells you not to do a simple spelling change. It tells you to do the yo change, this first person singular change that we talked about in the simple present indicative. So go ahead and pause the video and conjugate the verb traducir, very important verb for you learning Spanish, to translate. So go ahead and conjugate traducir in the simple present indicative and the simple present subjunctive. Use a verb sheet if you want, and then click play to check your answers. Okay, so hopefully you came up with traduzco in the yo form, and don't forget that I in the nosotros form, traducimos. We saw an E there, English E, Spanish E, in the last slide, because conocer is an ER verb, but traducir is an IR verb, so it uses the I in the nosotros ending there of the simple present indicative. Then we're going to use traduzc as our base on which to build all of the present subjunctive forms. That's our base right there. So hopefully you ended up with these endings in the simple present subjunctive, or with these conjugations rather. We used traduzc as our base for traduzca, traduzcas, traduzca, traduzcamos, traduzcan. So if you did that well, give yourself a pat on the back. If you messed up, sorry about that, I got distracted. But yeah, if you didn't do as well as you'd like to have done on this one, go back and rewatch this part, or pause the video and try another verb that ends in vowel CIR or vowel CER. You can get one from the list on pages 34 and 35 of your list of verbs organized according to their irregularities, and you can check your answers on wordreference.com. Okay, let's keen. Sigamos. We're going to look now at verbs that have this notation, indicating that we add a G, or we add an IG in the middle of the verb. We add it between the stem and the conjugation endings. And you're probably familiar with some of these verbs. They're very common. And they follow this same pattern of irregularity that we saw with the Z to ZC verbs. So let's take a look. Okay, the plus ig is going to affect all verbs that end with ayer. So take a look at that list. Which verbs are going to be affected and which verbs are not going to be affected. This one was pretty straightforward. It's a simple spelling thing. Pretty much all the verbs in this category are a form of either the verb caer or a form of the verb traer, two very common verbs. You might be confused because you think, well, oír, doesn't that have a G in the yo form? And you are correct, it does, but oír has some other anomalies, and you really just have to memorize the conjugations of the verb oír by themselves. Here we go, the verb caer. You can tell it's going to have this plus ig because it ends with aer. So if we were to conjugate caer normally in the simple present indicative, if we were to just eliminate the er and tack on our endings, this is what we would come up with. But if you've seen this verb before, you know that that first person singular form is not right. We don't say yo kao, we say yo, caigo, right? Hopefully that rings a bell for some of you. And since this is a first person singular stem changing verb, or a yo changer, what do you think is going to happen when we go to conjugate the simple present subjunctive? We're going to use caig as our basis on which to conjugate all of the subjunctive verbs, all of the subjunctive conjugations of this verb, rather. So you're going to see that ig showing up between the stem, ka, and the ending, which in the yo form of the simple present indicative is o, and in the forms of the simple present subjunctive start with a. So hopefully that isn't too complicated for you. Go ahead and try it with the verb traer. Check your answers on word reference. See how you do. If you do well, let's move on. We have a very similar concept here, the plus G, and this is going to affect verbs that are based on the roots of some very common verbs: poner, tener, valer, venir, salir. So look at these examples and see if you can figure out which of them is going to be affected by this change. If you said all of them, you would be correct. Every one of these verbs is based on one of the 5 verbs in that list. Yuxtaponer, componer, sobresalir, mantener. So if a verb has that as its base, one of those 5 verbs as its base, it's going to have this irregularity. So pause the video. Try to conjugate valer. You know it's going to have the same pattern that we've been seeing. You're going to add the G between the stem and the conjugated endings in the appropriate places. So pause the video and give it a go. Okay, so hopefully you caught that the first person singular form of the simple present indicative is not yo valgo, but rather valgo, yo valgo, right? So we inserted the G in between the stem and the ending. We're going to use that stem as our basis for the simple present subjunctive. If you did that well, give yourself a pat on the back. Using the G in all of the subjunctive forms. If you need more practice, carve out some time to do that. You can use the list on page 35 of your list of verbs according to their irregularities. Sigamos. All right, we have one more irregularity to talk about today, and that's the C that changes to a G. It's another first-person singular change in the simple present indicative. It's going to follow the same pattern. So it's not anything too earth-shattering, and it affects some very common verbs. Most of these verbs are probably verbs that are familiar to you. So let's take a look at some of the verbs that conjugate like hacer, because it's going to affect all these verbs. So the verb deshacer always conjugates like hacer. The verb satisfacer always conjugates like hacer. Don't be fooled by verbs like complacer and padecer that might sound a little bit like hacer. They might be spelled a little bit like hacer, but they're just going to follow the normal vowel CER pattern, which is with the ZC, and we talked about that before. So notice that the verb hacer and the verb satisfacer, they do end in vowel CER, but they have their own irregularity. And hopefully these are familiar verbs to you already. Satisfacer might not be as much. So why don't you give satisfacer a go right now? See if you can figure out what the irregularity is going to look like. Do it on a verb sheet. You might as well. You have to fill those out this semester anyway. This is going to be a C changing to a G in the yo form of the simple present indicative. And you know where to go from there. So pause the video and give it a go. Okay, hopefully you picked out that it should not be yo satisfaco, but rather yo satisfago, I satisfy. Okay, and then that form is going to be used in to build all of the simple present subjunctive forms. Okay, so those are all of the patterns that we have, all of the irregularities that we have in this category. But there are just a couple comments that I want to make before we finish up. My comment is that these yo changes, they tend to trump stem changes. So in verbs like tener and venir, you're not going to have the stem change and the yo change coexisting, and we'll see what that means. I think you already know tener and venir are very common verbs. I know you've seen them before, but it's just worth mentioning and reviewing here at the end. The other thing is that with the verb decir and verbs like decir, that says stem change. That should just say stem change. I apologize. But with verbs like decir, the irregularity, the stem change, actually blends with the yo irregularity. So while it's more common for the yo change to trump the stem change and do away with it, it's also possible that they could coexist. So let's look at two models. And you can see the mixed irregularities that start on page 35, I believe. Hopefully that page number is right. Okay, so the verb obtener, okay, to obtain. We've got a stem change, E to IE. We've got a yo change, the plus G. If we were to just do the stem change there, and it's a simple stem change, it's an ER verb, which only accommodates a simple stem change. So if we were to do that, we would end up with obtieno. And you probably know that tener is not yo tieno, but rather yo tengo. Whoopsies. Sorry, these are kind of messed up. But so yo tengo is what you're going to see there inside that yellow box, and then that's the form that we're going to use to conjugate the verb in the simple present subjunctive. Whoops, there it is. So we're not going to observe the stem change in the yo form of the simple present indicative. Okay, hopefully that makes sense for everyone. But here's an example of a verb where we have something else happening. Bendecir, it's based on the verb decir. It has this complex stem change in E to I, comma I, and it has a yo change, a C that changes to a G, okay, kind of like we saw with hacer, but we're going to see these two changes coexisting, sort of. So we know that it's not going to be yo bendico, because you know it's not yo digo, it's yo digo, right? So you're going to see the stem of that first person singular form in the simple present indicative. It's going to preserve the stem change, and oh, it's doing it again. I apologize. And in that little yellow box, you're going to see yo bendigo. And that's what you're going to use to form all of the simple present subjunctive forms. You're going to keep the I, and you're going to have the G. So, with all of that in mind, a practicar. It's time to practice. So, try some conjugation practice on Quizlet. The format on Quizlet is going to really help you prepare for the celebration of conjugation that you're going to have this coming weekend. And then I highly recommend that you start filling out the simple present indicative and the simple present subjunctive boxes on the about 20 verb sheets. Now you have 75, but you only have to do those. Those are, sorry, I'm distracted again. My son is making faces at me. Those are not actually due until the end of the semester, but if you wait, you will be really sad and your hand will cramp up. So please start working on those now. They'll help you study for the celebrations of conjugation. I'd like you to do 20 of them, not the whole sheet, but just the simple present tenses. Do 20 of them before class on Thursday. Okay, and if you need to check your answers on word reference, go for it. If you want to start working on the back as well, you'd be able to fill out the future informal indicative and the future informal subjunctive based on the lab work you did this weekend. And on that form, I only ask for the first person singular, or the yo form, so that goes really quickly. Okay, so give me a call if you have any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you later. Ciao.